So the focus of this presentation again is biogeography. And if I manage to pass the slide, now, all right. Well, I'm going to start with this. I'm going to use a lot of citations, which I always use the heading, so you can check on them later if you want. Invasive species are really interesting. They're horrible for the environment and the economy, but scientifically they're very interesting. And they attracted the attention of classic ecologists and biologists, including Darwin, Green, and Elton more recently, because they are unplanned experiments at huge spatial and temporal scales that would be unfeasible to implement. And it would be unethical also to implement if we were spreading exotic plants around the world. But because we very frequently know approximate introduction dates, and if we don't know it to the year, we'll at least know it to the decade, because there are always reports or herbarium samples from this invasive that start only on this year. That is a really important thing, because when we're studying evolution, we don't know how long a plant took to adapt to living in a mountaintop, for instance. It could be 100 years, it could be 1,000 years. We really don't know. With invasives, we do know they were introduced 100 years ago, sometimes only 50 years ago. And if we see that they have developed adaptations to mountaintops, we know that that's the time frame. And that's very important, because we're discovering that evolution is happening way faster than we previously imagined, in at least some cases. And I think that's all for this slide. I just wanted to use a couple of base subjects before we go to the actual thing. The other thing that I want to highlight is that biological invasions are dynamic. So at the beginning, of course, we have very few individuals that are introduced into the non-native range. If those individuals reach enough numbers and are able to survive in what usually is a very hostile environment, and let's say, and this is a very rough approximation, but some people say that only 10% of the exotic plants that are introduced are able to make a stable population that is not even invasive, which is a stable population that comes back, let's say every year if it's an annual. Now, if we at the management level are able to prevent the introduction, that will be the ideal and the most cost-effective way. And it's, for instance, what now that it's a little too late in Australia, but it's what now Australia has a very strict biosecurity controls at the border. But it saves money in the long run. If you're not able to prevent, then you can eradicate, but you can only eradicate when you have a few localized populations. If the populations are out of control and they're in an expansion, and you're having this increment in the abundance of the species, then you most likely can only aim for containment, just prevent further spread to other new areas, raise public awareness, try to contain it within the limits of what you have. You might not be able to get rid of it, especially for plants if they have persistent soil seed banks that can survive in the soil for 10, 20, sometimes even 30 years. You'll have to actually intervene for 30 years to get rid of those species. And then if you lose this battle too, and they just get crazy all around your country, and in which the invasive is fully established, widespread and abundant, and there may be some natural fluctuations, but you just have to focus on minimizing impact whenever you can, protect native species and native areas and natural areas that you want to protect, because that really your only chance. You probably will never be able to revert the situations in which you just get rid of this. So these two things are very important, that invasives are giving us insights about how plants work in general, and that invasions are dynamic, and that how we intervene depends on the stage of the species or the system that we want to manage. Now, going back to the importance of biogeography, there is one question that has baffled invasive ecologists since the beginning, really, is the fact that invasive weeds are just weeds in their native range. It's just native weeds. So these weeds are on roadsides, and they may be a little fun nuisance to farmers in the native range, but they're nothing compared to what an invasive can do to a farm or a rangeland. So what kind of checks and balances do we have in the native range that make that plant that is just a weed, a non-important weed in the native range, becomes this hugely successful, harmful plant in the non-native the range. Well, if we go and study what checks and balances are in the native range that are not there, we might learn something that we might be able to use here in order to contain, control, or simply manage these invasive species. And that's what hopefully I'll be able to do over this presentation. This is just a map of an estimation of number of species across the world by countries. And Australia, where I'm at now, I'm here at the tip of the Cape York Peninsula in the wet tropics. New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States have the doubtful honor of having some of the highest rates of invasive species in the world, followed by many on the other mostly industrialized countries. And also some of these might be related to under sampling and under reporting in some countries, as usual. I'm going to use as a guideline for this presentation this review by Jose Hierro, John Maron, and Ryan Callaway. All of them must be known to you because Jose did his PhD in Montana. He's now in Argentina. And John Maron and Ray Callaway are still active in Missoula, Montana, the Montana University system. I really like this review. I always come back to this because it's really a very nice way to show people why we shouldn't be focusing. Our first instinct or gut instinct is to focus on the problem at hand. The problem at hand is an invasive species we have here. We study it, we try to understand things, but we might have to go back to the native range and to other ranges to understand what's going on there, in able to actually make informed decisions here. This paper explains that very clearly. And we're going to go through the 7 main hypotheses that can explain invasive success and why biogeography is important for most of them, if not all of them, really, at least partially. So don't bother about this because it's a long list. But what I did is, what potential applications could we find from each of these main hypotheses? And there might be many other hypotheses or other names for these same hypotheses, but that's not really important for the purpose of this talk. Don't read this now because we'll go through them one by one. But I just made this up, and I expect to have some feedback on it because I might have missed something. I think more or less should be all right. And I'm going to start with essentially just explaining what is release from natural enemies for those who still don't know it, and why the knowledge about escape from or release from natural enemies is the base for the biocontrol activities that we do. Escape from natural enemies is a hypothesis that quite simply states that when a plant or an animal goes to another region, might go to a region where there are no predators or pathogens. And that allows that subject to actually thrive in that environment because it's released from that. Now it gets a little more complex when you think about specialist enemies and generalist enemies, which I think this image explains more or less intuitively. So this is the native range. And we have here 2 species of trees. And this is the tree of interest that has a native competitor. So it's competing with another plant. And it has a specialist enemy, an insect that only feeds on the leaves of this species, but not of this species. So it's a specialist that only feeds on this. And then there are generalist enemies, like a rabbit in this case, that just eats leaves of any plant. So that's why we call it generalist. And then the other species, though, in the native range, might have other specialist enemy, in this case, a caterpillar. Now, when the invasive is introduced into the non-native range, there may be other native competitions, which in this case is the same picture, but I would imagine that there will be other natives from that new region that will compete with the species, of course. We'll have generalist enemies that will eat all, because, you know, rabbits will be rabbits. But if it's not a rabbit, it's a deer, whatever it is. There will usually be generalist enemies that are able to feed on native and non-native species, unless there are a little chemicals involved, but we'll talk about that later. Excuse me. But there are no specialists. The fact that there are no specialists is very important, because the plants defend themselves from specialists by producing chemicals that are toxic to those specialists. So this caterpillar here, which is another caterpillar in the non-native range, might not be able to eat this because of those chemicals. or it might not be able to eat it just because it's not interested in the plant. But this plant at the beginning will be producing those chemicals, and that has a cost. By natural selection, it might turn out that plants producing less chemicals just have more fitness because there is no one eating them despite having no chemicals. So that's give them another competitive advantage. This is the most complex situation you can find in enemy release, considering specialists and generalists. In the simplest way, you just bring a plant to a place where there are no herbivores, no one is eating it, the plant grows large. And of course, if we introduce a herbivore, that's biocontrol, and that could control the plant. An example of enemy release would be Acacia albara in this case. And we did also the study with acacioelongifoliae, which is another species of acacia native to Australia that is invasive in Europe and elsewhere. What we found is that this is the proportion of seeds which are viable, which is slightly over 50%, which had an abortion, they're non-viable seeds, and which are preyed upon by insects. In total, in Australia, the native range, only half of the seeds can at least have a chance to survive. And this is pre-dispersal. There may be post-dispersal seed predators and stuff. Now in Portugal, there is no pre-dispersal seed predation. It's just no bugs. It's an enemy release. No insect is able to just lay eggs on the pods or the buds to have wasps that will eat the seeds of the plants. So obviously that is increasing the fitness of the plants in Portugal more than they will be in the native range. And also there is a reduction in infertility, which may be related to many other things, because this is an insect pollinated species, so there may be other kind of pollinators helping, or they may just simply have more resources. Simply an example, there are many, many examples of enemy release, and of course I'm biased to use my own studies because are the ones that I have more at hand. This is not my study, but a very good group in Portugal launched a biological control system for this Acacia longifolia and Acacia albara, which they got this little wasp from Australia, and they spent 10 years under control conditions, making sure that those wasps will not lay eggs on any other native species in Portugal. They will only lay eggs on acacia, which are all invasive. But they had to do a huge amount of work just trying almost every legume in the country to make sure that this wasp will not have a negative impact in the natives, because all too often, unfortunately, we have biological control going bad, like really bad. I don't expect you to read this, but here in far north Queensland, we produce sugar. There's a lot of sugarcane fields. It's tropical. And they had a beetle that was lowering the productivity. So they thought, well, let's just do some biological control. And they took this cane toad and introduced it. As it happens, the cane toad, it's venomous. They didn't like very much the sugarcane, so they expanded to natural habitats where they kill any animal that tried to eat them. I mean, even crocs will die if they eat them. The cats, any native predator, even phyton snakes will die if they eat them. So they very quickly learned that they couldn't eat them. So essentially now, no biological control for cane toads. And I think someone mentioned that there is actually a snake that is able, a specialized snake that is able to eat these poisonous, these venomous frogs. But I think people is not very happy about the idea of introducing yet another snake that might or might not eat the cane toads. So we have to be very, very careful with biological control. The rewards are potentially very high, but it's risky business. So that warning definitely remains there. Following our line of thought, we're going to go to evolution of invasiveness. Studying the evolution of invasiveness, I believe is very important, but you might see that I will put more or less slides in some of these subjects, depending on what I've been working more. I've been working a lot in evolution, novel weapons, a little in disturbance. So I'll probably spend more time on those, but we'll go through all of them. understanding how plants evolve and detecting which ones are better fit might help us to select high-risk populations. If we have limited resources and we have to really focus our efforts somewhere to have the highest return for investment, knowing how plants have evolved and which traits are being more successful can let us target those populations which are more successful for control. So this will be lowering the fitness of the species at an evolutionary level, which I think is pretty cool. Again, going to the same acacia system, this is acacioelongifoliae. What we saw here is, this is the size of the seed, the black part here, and this is the size of the elaiosome, which is this protein appendix that the seeds have as a reward to ants for seed dispersal. What you can see here is that seeds from Australia are smaller than seeds from Portugal. Even though the elaiosome has the same size, or is even smaller in Portugal, in any case, it's proportionally lower here than here, indicating that probably seed dispersal by ants is less important in Portugal. But also, and more importantly, that the seeds here are significantly larger than seeds in Australia, which is telling us that the species is having access to some kind of resource that they didn't have here. It might be that they're not using chemical defenses. It might be that they have a kind of route that lets them exploit water that is unavailable to natives in the community. There will be research on that, but we're seeing again how evolution is acting. And of course, this will not act equally in all populations, and we'll go up to that a little later. I think we were in evolution information already. Okay. This is a very interesting work that my student geography led, in which we got 3 thistles, which are native from Europe, and which are, all of them are introduced into the western coast of the United States, mostly California, really. But for Susceptible, which is the invasive one, even in Oregon, and even close to Montana, you can find some small populations, but it's really invasive in California. These 2 are present there too, but they're naturalists. These kind of populations, which at the beginning we said we should aim to eradicate. We still are at a point in which we can eradicate these 2 species from the United States because there are very few populations. We cannot eradicate probably Solstitialis, yellow star thistle. It's probably too late. But we thought it would be interesting to study these species both in the native range in Europe and in the invasive range in the United States. So we did, these are the distributions in Europe for the invasive, for the averagely invasive, and for the definitely not invasive, which only has a handful of populations. And we did find again that plants in California were significantly bigger biomass than plants from the native range of Spain. We're comparing Spain, California. And the interesting part though was that, as you can see here, the non-invasive species, not yet, were still increasing their size. So either there is an access to a resource that is not available in the native range, they're just evolving. And they're evolving traits that are not giving them yet the ability to expand brutally like yellow star thistle did on the right, but it might give them in the future. So the surprising thing is that all exotic plants, and these are very closely related, of course, in the same genus, all exotic plants seem to be developing at least some of the same adaptations. Now, when we go to spine length, and you can see that the Capitula has very long spines, even though Calcitrapa had longer spines in millimeters, and Sulfuria had shorter, the invasive one, which was in the middle, had increased its spine size in California as compared to genotypes from Spain. Spain is, by the way, the probable origin of the seeds that were introduced into California via Chile. But genetic studies show that Spain and Chile are very similar, and they're the main origin for seeds in California. So this was very interesting. All exotic non-invasive and exotic invasive seem to be doing things. They're definitely exposed to different environments. They're being selected for, and they're adapting, but they're not adapting all the traits. This one might not need it because it already has like huge thorns. But this one might benefit from this because there may be like more livestock, for instance. Very quickly, in a different study, we saw germination, immediate germination, and this has to do with dormancy probably, was way higher also in California than in Spain. And it did also happen for the 3 species. So this is very interesting. It's telling us that these evolutionary changes are happening, and this is happening in 150 years or less, which is fascinating because these are adaptive changes in plants that have been grown over generations, have reduced maternal effects, etc. Now, of course, in this plot here, I'm just showing you an average for a large number of individuals from a large number of populations from either California or Spain. But this is just an average, but the problem with this kind of representation is that we're missing some of the variability within the regions. So Maron, Villa, and others, I think this is the first article that actually showed adaptive evolution for an invasive species being different from native and non-native range. So it's a really important paper in 2004. And I like it because it just shows the variability of populations within each of the ranges and between ranges. It's just, and of course, if they actually plot here the individuals between the population, you'll still get more variability across this space here. And here's the thing. Plants do not adapt to one single thing in the non-native range. There are slightly different conditions and gradients in those areas, and they may be adapting better to some of them than to others. And that is a really good tip when we are planning managing these species. And especially if we're planning, considering that there may be climate change that will maybe reduce precipitation or maybe will just increase temperature, but not precipitation. If we know the predictions for our area, and we know that some populations may be better adapted to drought, for instance, or some other populations may be better adapted for higher temperature, if they're not correlated, which we usually are. We may actually choose to act on the populations that are better adapted for future climates. If we know which populations are adapted to future climates, we may be able to, again, get more bang for our buck when we are spending tons of money in managing these invasive populations. Moving forward to empty niche. Empty niche means that the invasive plants are arriving to an habitat in which the native species are not able to exploit all the resources that are there for whatever evolutionary or historical constraints. Then invasives go there and maybe they have a kind of root that goes very deep, and the natives don't have roots that go that deep. And then that ability to exploit the water table so deep gives the invasives a lot of resources which they can outcompete the others because they just have this untapped resource. The idea for restoration is we should try to fill those empty niches. These are really nice review. I think it's a Trends Ecology and Evolution. You want to have a look to it, but very simply, and it's a more complex paper, but very simply, let's say this is the space of available resources in an invaded area, and this is based on a PCA of leaf mass area, nitrogen, water use efficiency, photosynthetic rate. It doesn't really matter. The idea is that this is the space of resources available or of functional traits available, and the natives are covering this, exploiting these resources, which are well in the middle and they're well adapted to most of the resources and probably the most valuable in the area. Now invasives come and there is an overlap, but the invasives are able to exploit these other resources. And being able to exploit this means that they might get a competitive advantage that allows them to beat the natives even within this space because, they're also good at this, but they're also good at this. So they get that extra help. The idea in restoration, of course, will be to try to find native plants with functional traits which are better prepared to compete with the traits that the invasives are taking advantage of the most. Very simply, I've never worked in restoration directly, so I expect that you might know more than me about this and might give useful feedback during the questions. Novel weapons, I worked a little more in this area, so this will be just a tad longer. But essentially, novel weapons refers to the chemicals that the plants use to defend themselves in their native range. And these chemical defenses are brought with them naturally when they are brought to another continent or region. And now many of these chemicals will be known in that region, and the species living there will be kind of habituated to them. But if they're very specific, specialized chemicals, then in fact, there might be novel weapons and might give them a disproportionate advantage in those areas. What is very well known, and this is a very recent publication in Biological Invasions, is that invasives have a lot of chemicals. They tend to have it. It's predominantly invasives have allelopathic compounds in the native range and of course in the native range. Here's an example of a eucalypt, a native from Australia. Eucalyptus globulus is the most planted species in the world. Pinus as a genus may be more planted, but as a species, as an individual species, Eucalyptus globulus is the most planted species in the world for paper pulp, mostly. And what we did here was we went to eucalyptus forest and measured what plants were growing below the eucalypt and what plants were growing away from the eucalypts, and which has made a difference. So we made an index with, it wouldn't be 50% minus 0.5, but something like that, just so you get the idea of this interaction index. What we saw is that when we compare plants out of eucalypts, plants below eucalypts, there is a reduction in species richness below the eucalypt, but it's not too bad. And these are two populations in Australia, two in the US, Chile, India, and Portugal. You can see that in the non-native regions, there's a huge reduction in biodiversity below the eucalypts. It's just huge. And these are not planted forestry managed places. These are places which have escaped or might have been abandoned plantations in which there is some natural revegetation. But it's just simply, there are way less species below the eucalyptus forest than elsewhere in the habitat, because the eucalypts have a lot of chemicals. And those chemicals, as we can see in the next slide, reduce the germination and growth of other species. So we got native species from Australia and from each of the other non-native ranges, except Portugal, for historical reasons. And which is measured, we germinated the seeds, and then we measured the growth of the roots within the petri dish for a few weeks. And we saw that for some native species of Australia, when they were exposed to eucalypt extract that was dissolved in the water in the petri dish, for some species in the native range, there was actually a significant reduction in root growth. So even for some Australian species, eucalypt extract can reduce the growth of the roots of natives. But it's only for one species, a little for another, no reduction for a couple more. What seems to be like an increment in root growth for a species that had been exposed to eucalypt extract, that for controls, which was a little surprising. Of course, when you go to natives from the United States, Chile, or India, all of them have huge reduction in root growth, which reaches 100% in some cases, and that is not lower than 40% in any case. But this clearly explains that seeds that will reach the under canopy of a eucalypt forest will have a really hard time to germinate first and to grow later. And that will be a huge comparative disadvantage, which is exactly what the eucalypt wants to do. What happens here in the native range is that the native community has co-evolved with the eucalypts, and they have developed a resistance to this poison. And at least some of the species have developed that tolerance and are able to thrive even for some species below when exposed to these chemicals. That's why this will be a novel weapon here. These plants have had no exposure to eucalypt chemicals, and they just have no way to deal with those chemicals physiologically. Some of these plants don't either, but many of them, yes, do, because they have co-evolved with the eucalypts. And that is at the essence of the novel weapons hypothesis. Now, why is this useful for restoration? Well, again, because there is variation. And this is a variation between countries. See, this is the native range for Centaurea societalis, your statistic. In this case, which is made an extract and germinated lettuce seeds as a phytometer. And all of them have huge reductions. Lettuce germinates to 100% always. And we had controls, and it did germinate to 100%. When you expose lettuce to the extract of the plants, it's always a reduction of 75%. But there are differences in that reduction. In the native range and in some non-native ranges, the reductions are huge. In California and Australia, interestingly, the reduction is slightly lower. So this is still giving them an advantage, but they're probably producing less amount of these chemicals because they might not need them. They might be just being perfectly competitive because of other traits. But it's interesting that there is a variation across regions because there is also variation within regions. And this is a fantastic study and a fantastic line of research by Lankow and others, in which they found, they studied the age of the population of an invasive plant. And the species was introduced here in the Eastern United States more than 100 years ago, and then it expanded from there. And then they went to find populations that had expanded very recently, as little as 1 to 14 years only. So this map just means the hotter it is, the more recent, and this is the older. It doesn't mean that it is more invaded, just the population has been there for less time. But what is fascinating is that they found that the longer the population had been there, the lower the production of this allelochemical was. Now that was fascinating, because it seems like the plants need it at the beginning, and this is the same species in the same region. The plants need it at the beginning when they're crashing with the native undisturbed communities, but they might not need it when they have well-established populations, because these chemicals are very expensive to produce. And it's not only one way. I'm not going to go into all these texts, but very briefly, what they were finding is not only the species was producing less chemicals in the populations in which they've been for the longest, but the native communities in those areas were also already developing some tolerance to these chemical products, which is fascinating because we thought that these coevolutionary dynamics will span over millennia, and we're finding that this is happening within 100 years. Even the native communities are learning how to tolerate these chemicals, and then because they're learning to tolerate them, it's not as important for the invasive to keep producing them because they're very expensive. So they just keep a base level. Let's say they don't get rid of them, but they just keep a base level, but they don't overdo it because they're not getting a great return for investment for doing a lot of very expensive chemicals. Similarly, in this other study, we see how over time, populations that have been exposed to hagweed, another invasive weed, had an initial reduction in biomass because of the presence of the invasive, but they were actually able to recover. Whereas in hagweed absent populations, well, there was no trend or even a slight decline, but there was no difference really. And this is in a way gives you some hope that, you know, maybe it won't be so bad in the future. The problem in the future is that after 50 years, you might have lost a lot of endangered species and you're not going to recover that. The habitat will always adapt in some way or another, but you might be able to recover the species that you've lost or the habitats that you have, you know, lost forever. Now, this is another really interesting paper by Callaway, Maron, and others, and I did a very small part on this one, but I found this fascinating. What they did here is that there's this Potentilla recta, which is an invasive. So they grow in pots Potentilla recta, they grow in pots festuca, and they grow in pots the native Potentilla argura, which is a native from North America. And then they grew them, they took the plants off, and then they planted again in the same pots with that soil, planted again each of the species. They planted in this case for this graph, the invasive. They planted the invasive on the pot that previously had festuca, and there was no difference between sterile and non-sterile soil. And this sterile and non-sterile soil is useful to compare the role of soil pathogens, because there is always soil pathogens that accumulate in the pots and in the soils. And if you grow in plants in those, over time, and even farmers know this, that's one of the advantages of rotation of crops, is that you don't over-accumulate one single pathogen that is specialized in eating corn. If you change corn and wheat, the pathogens of wheat are growing this year, the pathogens of corn go down. When you go back, the pathogens of corn go back, but the wheat go down, but they never have a super high abundance. And something like that happens here. You grow Portentilla on Festuca, which is a grass, and there is almost no effect. Now, you grow Portentilla recta on a pod that had Portentilla recta, and you see there is a huge reduction in biomass. And we think that it's because of soil pathogens, of course, that have accumulated and reduced the fitness of the plant. The interesting part is that when you plant the invasive on a pod that had a native that was on the same genus, you experience the same reduction. And this is really helpful because you're planning on restoring plant communities and you're thinking on these allelopathy and soil pathogens, considering that you might have, if not congeneric species, at least species in the same family or phylogenetically as close as possible. There might be an important overlap on functional traits, which we saw was very important to cover for entinage. And there may be also other added benefits, like bringing soil pathogens, which ironically may be more suitable to act also on the invasive. So I think this work is really, really important, and it can give a lot of inspiration for future management intervention. Moving quickly to disturbance. Disturbance is a very important part of biological invasions. Look, invasives benefit from disturbance. However you look at it, there are clear significant effects on diversity, on abundance, depending on habitats. You know, forests, clearly, disturbance in forests is a main factor for invasions. Nutrient addition, grazing, anthropogenic disturbance have huge effects, benefit hugely biological invasions, both in terms of abundance and in terms of the diversity of invasives that you're gonna get. And this is based on observational and experimental. This is the effect size. So the more to the right, the larger the effect that you're having of each of these factors in benefiting invasive species. Just very briefly, yes, biological invasions and disturbance go hand in hand. This is for now famous Centralis osteotialis. We ran some models with the functional traits that we knew, and this is an increasing range of disturbance. And what we found is that Centralis osteotialis was only able to establish permanent populations in competition at high disturbance rates. At low disturbance rates, actually, the very successful invasive Centralis osteotialis cannot establish stable populations. And that is a very important take-home message. If you are protecting an area, chances are that if you stop disturbance or limit disturbance seriously, you're going to be able to control the species just by letting things happen. And this is interesting because some of the management interventions usually have involved serious disturbance. When you're removing the weed, sometimes it may be an option to consider to actually, I'm not going to say not do nothing. We could introduce other species, we could do a lot of things, but if you have a soil seed bank that is going to come back, you might not want to just mow everything. It may be more interesting to introduce more species and let those species outcompete this in the absence of disturbance. Because when there is disturbance, many invasive, and especially invasive weeds, will be always the winners. If you regularly mow, if you regularly plow the land, or have livestock in the land, which is obviously an economic activity that we want, then is when the invasives are going to succeed. If you don't, and it might not be an option for every piece of land that you want to restore, but definitely stopping disturbance is going to be a major tool for land management. And I made a very little review recently, and you might want to read it. It's only like 2 or 3 pages. But one of the things, and I wasn't aware of the magnitude of this until I actually wrote this review, was most invasive species are actually ruderal plants. Ruderal means adapted to disturbance in the native range. They're plants that are already, and this is, I think, a new term now. It's the plant traits economic spectrum, slow, fast. So in the slow, you might think on an oak tree that grows very slowly, reproduces very slowly, has long lifespan. And the fast side of the plant functional trait economic spectrum will be a weed, like an annual that has a life cycle in 3 months, produces a lot of seeds very quickly, grows very quickly, dies very quickly. Then this is not to scale, it's just a cartoon. But invasive plants overwhelmingly are, in an overwhelming manner, are ruderal weeds in the native ranges. And when they move to non-native ranges, they are selected to become even more ruderal. Most of the traits that we're seeing correspond with an increase in ruralization of a ruderal species after time and natural selection is acting in the non-native range. And I find that fascinating, but if you think about it, if you think in the classic example of the road being open in the Amazon forest, that's a disturbance. It's a disturbance that is destroying an habitat, that is creating disturbance around the road, so changing the habitat conditions in a way that benefits ruderal species. And it's at the same time most likely introducing propagules of these species that will be able to take advantage of this. So it will be very hard for an invasive species to invade a well-established Amazonian forest, for instance. But it will be very easy for it to start colonizing the roadsides. And from there, if there are increasing disturbances, then they will keep expanding. And that's at the base of many, many biological invasions, to a degree that you won't believe. It doesn't mean that pristine environments are not suitable to be invaded. They are. But the gateways to get to them are always disturbance. Now, species richness, this overlaps with the emptiness that we talked, so I'm going to go over it very briefly. But if we just leave an area undisturbed, there are a series of dispersal filters, environmental filters, and biotic interaction filters that might make the regional species pools not being able to restore the local community as it should. Whereas if we actually make a wise intervention, an informed intervention, in which we make sure that most of the functional traits that we need are introduced, species richness in general, you could infer that the richer, the better in every sense. But because resources are limited, you might want to focus your efforts on species that are keystone species that are going to give you the full range of traits and cover the full range of niches, as opposed to just simply wait for nature to cover it, because there may be actually quite a bit of hindrances that might prolong the time that you will need for that to recover way longer than a cost-effective intervention. Finally, propagule pressure. It's a clear reason for biological invasions. And I'm going to go very quickly over this, but it's very easy. You put more seeds, you have more chances that the species will establish. If you still introduce more seeds, you're giving them more genetic richness, and the more genetic richness they have, the more phenotypes they have for natural selection to act upon, so they can actually adapt to the slightly different conditions of the non-native range, the higher the chance that you'll get an invasive. So very simply, you get more seeds, propagules, wherever the probability of establishment grows. And I'm not gonna get into these different things, but it's very intuitive, really. And of course, the solution for that is just be very strict on biosecurity border controls as a country, and then within regions, actually, to be able to localize the areas that have heavily infested and just stop the movement of soil or goods or whatever is necessary so it doesn't spread. Containment. And in fact, and this is just an example, but this article was able to very successfully predict which areas were more susceptible to be invaded by populations in the region based on the human activities in the area and based on the kind of habitat and the state of health of those habitats. And it worked very well. And this can be a really good example, not very old, for you if you wanna delve deeper into this. Now, you thought I was finished, but sorry, I have still a few more slides because I think climate change really is gonna mess everything up. Everything we've seen, we kind of had tools to handle them. I'm not so sure we'll have tools for this, because it's not just invasives that we need to worry about now. We need to worry about the natives. And animals are the obvious ones, in which, for instance, here, you have all these ungulates, which because of climate change will be shifting north. But when they're shifting north, they're actually displacing other species that might or might not be able to shift north. And some of them will just have no land, and they might actually get extinguished because of climate change, yes, but because of displacement by other native species, which is covering their range because they're better adapted to climates which used to be here and now are here. And they just made them more competitive. And very simply, this is not just something that affects one species. This article is interesting because it's comparing range shifters, which are native, which are shifting their range, with invasives. And this is one of the things where we talked at the beginning, why invasives are so important, because they're giving us a clue about how natural systems work. And because we have been studying invasives for at least a century quite intensively, we're now able to understand what could happen to native species which need to shift their distributions because of changing climatic conditions. So very simply, there are three scenarios for a plant. A plant currently has an herbivore that keeps them at one size. The herbivore is controlled by a carnivore. If nothing happens, this stays. If the carnivore is not able to migrate north, for instance, and only the herbivore and the plant are able to migrate for whatever reason, then the plants will suffer because there will be no one to control the herbivore. Now, if neither the carnivore or the herbivore migrate, well, if the herbivore doesn't migrate, the carnivore cannot migrate because it has nothing to eat, then the plants will actually thrive in that environment because they will have escaped the enemies that they used to have. And this will work for native species too. And that's the interesting part. It's not enough that a plant is able to colonize things in the north. It needs to bring their mutualists with them. And it might even need to bring with them their herbivores and carnivores. And you have to shift the whole ecosystem to give some stability. But then they will be occupying the range of other species that was there before that might or might not be able to migrate north. So things are going to get really complicated. And what are invasives going to do? Are they going to benefit? Well, spoiler alert, yes. And then again, another meta-analysis. So more to the right means yes. And and these are natives and these are invasives. These are marginally significant difference. This is a significant difference. Elevated CO2 disproportionately benefits invasive species. Elevated temperature disproportionately benefits invasive species. And others, not so much. But generally, yes, invasive species are expected to increase their distributions with global change. There's hope, though. Protected areas offer refuge for invasive species, even for invasive species that are spreading under climate change. And I'm going to be very brief because we don't have much time. And again, even plant soil feedback needs to be considered on this. It's not enough that plants and animals are moving or not moving, but all the underground fungal mutualisms or antagonisms might not be able to change at the same rhythm. And that is going to become, even if we have the same species, we're going to see different sizes and different changes. And well, here's the literature, you want to review it. But it's a very interesting and really scary in a way of thinking, because we really don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. For invasives, well, they seem to be doing pretty well. For natives, we'll see. Wrapping up, and this is the last slide. Just highlight that invasive biology without biogeography, focusing only on the invasive we have at hand, is like driving without a map. We don't know where we're coming from, and we don't really know where we go. Whereas if we study biogeography, we see what the species has done in other invasive regions, and we see what the species has done in the native regions. So we need to know how the species behaves, both in native and non-native regions. And we need to know how it behaves in other non-native regions too. And that's all for me for today. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions. It took a little longer than I expected. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Danny. Hey, there's Rick Callaway. Whoever wants to go first, if you on Zoom land would like to just unmute yourself and we'll ask a question, or I can't see whether somebody's raising their hands. It's probably best to just unmute yourself.
Hi, Robert. This is Bev Hartline. Daniel, that was an outstanding talk.
Wow, thank you.
I know nothing about this area, but the I want to ask sort of a big picture question. from your perspective, thinking about, going forward, what do you think are the key questions that need to be answered now?
Well, good question, right? Look, I really think we need to learn more about these complex network interactions. I think these networks and how these networks react to whatever environmental changes could be coming, it's going to be critical. And we know a little thanks to what we learned from invasive species, but certainly not enough. And for what we know, these are very complex systems, above ground and below ground, with lots of things going on at the same time, a lot of selective forces acting, and it gets increasingly complex to a way that overwhelms me. But I know there is very smart people out there who is actually working on these things, and they're finding very interesting things. But I would say that's the way to go. Yeah.
Somebody has a question here in the classroom. Thank you, Danny, so much. We might have a couple of questions here if people on Zoom are still thinking. It was fascinating to kind of understand, of course, that the longer a species spans at the range, an exotic species at the range, the better it gets adapted. And then, for example, its allelopathic effects will be diminished. And I'm just thinking about the history of Europe. And Europe has been a forested area thousands of years ago, and now it's open grasslands and arable fields. And you know that as well, that we are just having those aerophyte species that were coming before the big geographical discoveries, before Columbus, I would say. And then we have those neophytes that definitely came after with the big geographic discoveries. So that is just fascinating. Do you think that in like a couple of 100 years, those invaders spent enough time that they will be completely naturalized and they will be no problem if we don't introduce new ones? But of course we always do, right?
Well, look, I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's something it's good to discuss because it's an interesting finding, but I wouldn't overdo it with it. I like to compare this to climate change. Yes, species have increased their distributions historically many times, and that has led to dramatic changes in the evolutionary history of the land masses. And the Earth has experienced climate change before. It's just the speed at which these things are happening. The speed of climate change is so quick that organisms might not be able to adapt quickly enough to survive, or to survive in a way that sustains the ecological functions that we as humans need to survive, right? Likewise with biological invasions, yes, of course, nature will adapt to them eventually, but if by then, because it's happening so quickly and with such an intensity, and in some countries this might be more strict, like in Australia, but it's also one of the countries with most invasive species already. So it's happening so quickly that the native communities might not have time to adapt. And by might not have time, I mean that their basic functioning will be deeply disrupted and many, many species will be lost forever. There will be massive extinction in a way because of this. And there will be a massive disruption of the ecosystem services that they can provide to us so that we can live in a planet that is livable. It's the speed of it more than the fact that, of course, invasives will become natives at some point. Yes, that's a no-brainer. The problem is that it's just happening too quickly, and we might not but the habitats and the ecosystem might not be able to react quickly.
Yes, thank you, Danny, so much. Ray actually raised his hand. I would just suggest to unmute yourself, Ray.
Good to see you, Danny, and good to see your beautiful T-shirt.
Yeah, my birthday gift.
Yeah, that's very nice. So my thought is, my question is, it's a lot easier just to compare exotic invaders to a bunch of native plants in the same range, exotics to natives. Do you see an advantage in your biogeographical approach that can't be matched by doing something like that? Or just, what do you think about just simply comparing exotics to natives versus exotics in the native range to exotics in the non-native range?
Well, I mean, ideally, we will do both. We'll study exotics and natives on the native range and exotics and natives on the invasive range. That will be, you know how these things, experimental designs increase logarithmically, right? Ideally, we will compare both, of course. I suppose it really depends on exactly what question you need to answer. One or the other will be better. I'm not saying you don't have to do it at all. I'm just saying that you will always benefit from increasing and including the native range in your studies. And the more complex the design, the better, as long as it's, manageable to you, I suppose. What is your opinion? Okay.
I don't know if Ray will come back. Maybe he will. I think that's a fascinating question. Regarding to that one, so and also for restoration perspectives, Danny. So we have those locally spreading species that are almost considered, they're not invaded, they don't match the criteria for being invaders. But for example, Calamagrostis epigeios back in Europe is that local spreading species that keeps up secondary succession for decades. And so in a way, is that a good thing in a way for like a restoration perspective? Because still it's a native species, it keeps succession stagnating for a while, but do you think we could benefit from those locally spreading and maybe, better, adapting species for climate change and so forth?
Well, look, I do have a question for you, since you are more experienced on restoration than I am. Do you think that there are conditions in which, for instance, a highly contaminated soil, in which invasives could actually be useful to reclaim those soils, to extract those metals from the soil, and then to control afterwards?
For asking that back. I think that question could have several ramifications. For a first point, I would say, yeah, sure. Sometimes, because they develop bigger biomass, they can actually maybe be even better phytoremediators at a site. We could benefit, for example, when taking up land from a site. But on the other hand, what you just mentioned about the novel weapons, that they can actually put instead some kind of allelopathic materials in that, which on the long run would not help us, because we understand from the literature that those allelopathic compounds many times can stay for a very, very long time in the soil. So I'm not sure if we better off trying to really find the best local native hyper or phytoremediation suitable species, or should we really go towards a very effective cleanup with invaders? I don't know why I'm asking that, like you to Ray.
Look, I think it's a fair question. I mean, maybe even better than using any other chemical procedure. We have to be careful. I will consider that almost like biocontrol. Like, can we use invasives for restoration? If we do, we have to take the same extreme precautions that we take with biocontrol, because it can very quickly and very easily get out of control. So you have to trade off, is it really worth to do 10 years of research to make sure that this plant that I'm gonna use it doesn't get out of control, or maybe just take another approach. I will to using natives, but I'm not saying you will never benefit from it. I don't know. Just be very, very careful though.
Yes. If people have questions or any comments from the Zoom, there are still a couple of participants out there. We have still also some students in the classroom here. If you guys have anything to add, I'm sure Dan would be happy. It's still early over there.
It's early in the morning. I'm all yours.
Yeah. So along those lines, Danny, and again, somebody just should weigh in, because probably we could talk about that with Danny. Considering a restoration here in Butte, Montana, which you probably visited back when you were here in Montana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Restoration is going on, unfortunately, with a non-native grass on the Butte Hill. The caps actually are containing a species that is called breasted wheatgrass, Agropyra cristatum. And we have a native plant, so-called native plant program, and our mission is to diversify those caps that are already colonized with a non-native species. I would say it's an invader, totally establishes nicely, but it holds basically the caps in place. But in the long run, we actually just see that it's almost impossible to put in anything that is native and, as for species diversity, structural diversity, we almost would say we need to restart restoration on those sites. And given, 30 years or 40 years that cap has been as a aggressive wheatgrass dominated land, we don't really have other choices. So I'm just it just came into my mind that, yes, we are already using invaders. It's not in a strict terms because aggressive wheatgrass is used on the road sides and everywhere, but I think it's one of the examples. Anyways.
Yeah, it's a very challenging work, really, to work.
Exactly what I see there.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I don't know what to say. It's a very difficult situation. Yeah.